Skratka, a veste, kako je ponavadi na festivalih, ko na začetku na otvoritvah ljudje pridejo gor, ne, in potem začnejo govoriti, da imajo totalno neke posebne goste. Ne? In zdaj včasih se to pokaže kot upravičeno, včasih mogoče malo manj. Ampak se mi zdi, da letos spet imamo gostje, katerih samo delo kaže na to, da je upravičeno, če rečemo, da sta posebni. Ti gosti sta Greta Schiller in Andree Weiss. Z Greto Schiller se bomo več pogovarjali naslednji teden, ko bomo predstavili njen film Paris was a woman, oziroma Paris je bila ženska. Danes pa se bomo posvetili povsem novemu filmu Andree Weiss z naslovom Kosti, spotike oziroma Bones of Contention. Skratka, Andree Weiss je neodvisna režiserka, producentka, skupaj z Greto Schiller imata neodvisno producentsko hišo. Andree Weiss je tudi avtorica več knjižnih del. Enega izmed njih imamo tukaj tudi v prevodu, imenuje se Vampirke in vijolice. Tukaj jo imamo zahvaljujoč Nataši Velikonja, ki je knjigo prevedla. Čau, Nataša. Skratka, pogledali si bomo njen popolnoma nov film, ki se ukvarja z zgodovinskim spominom v Španiji v času frankizma. In začetek. Good evening, Andrea. How are you?
Hello.
How do you like it here for now? Coming from New York to this, I almost said village, but of course I cannot because it's the capital.
Well, to New Yorker, it's a little like a village, but I like it here a lot.
Okay. Actually, I just have a few questions about your work before we start the screening. And let me start with this one. In a recent interview, I heard you say that you believe that democracy only works when you have educated populists. And I somehow, in this statement, I somehow find the aim of your work, and actually, this is where I see why your work is so important. But still, to hear it from you, why do you do what you do?
It's kind of like if every person had to sit here and think, what makes me tick? What makes me do what I do? I mean, it's who I am. I'm driven to, it's funny, if you're a documentary filmmaker, you're driven by a lot of reasons that aren't really rational. That it's not always that you have a clearly thought out plan. This is what I'm going to do with my life, You're driven to make films because you care deeply about certain things, you feel passionate about certain subjects. I think if you thought rationally about your life, you would do something else. Do you need to translate or are we just speaking English?
No.
Okay. No. Because it's a really difficult thing to do, to make films, and it's not very lucrative, and it takes years to make one good film. But in this, I think with me, I'm really interested in history. I feel like we really need to understand history, and not just the history that's in the history books, especially the history that's not in the history books. The stories of real people who've done courageous things or outstanding things, even though they may not have certain privileges, they're not necessarily in the mainstream. So I want to tell those stories, and I want people to hear those stories and learn from them. And I guess in that thread, you could probably see woven through all my films.
And as I mentioned, you work as an independent filmmaker. And independence comes with some obvious benefits, I guess, but it also comes with certain costs. So how does an independent lesbian woman documentary filmmaker survive in these hyper-competitive conditions?
Well, although I think it's a good thing that because of the digital revolution, pretty much everyone has access to the media. of filmmaking. It also makes it incredibly harder for each and every person who wants to make a film, because everyone out there wants to make a film. And so in that sense, I feel very fortunate that I'm not starting out now, and that I started out making films in the 1980s when it was expensive, for sure, because you were shooting on film instead of video, but it was not so competitive. And so, I don't know, my partner Greta and I just tackled each project as we got involved in it. It was an uphill battle always for every single film to get the funding, to get the film made, to do the research, because it was often on topics that had never been researched, or there was no way to just easily find the research. The research was always an enormous, enormous part of our films. And we just kept going. We didn't think about the whole, trajectory of all the years of all the films and everything. We just thought about the film in front of us that we were making, which was always an uphill battle, and we just had to make it and get it done somehow. So that's how we did it. We pieced together funding from a lot of little sources. We often went into debt and supported, did things on our own, just as cheap. Like this film you're about to see, I did get some grants. You'll see in the credits, I got some grants for it. But this film was made on very, very, very little money. Very little money. And if you have the will and the determination to make films, you just keep going and you don't let that stop you.
Just keep going. Okay, coming closer to the film, actually. So in the past few years, we can really observe this proliferation of films on Nazi extermination of Jews and other destructions and wars, etc., etc. You actually dug into these subjects, I guess, in the 90s with Seed of Sarah. But what I find really pioneering in your work is that you add the sexual difference in the stories, for example, in Escape to Life, right? But as a New Yorker, you now dug into historical memory of Spain and homosexuals in Spain during frankismo. Is there any particular reason why you went exactly in that area?
Well, we were living in Spain for a while, and so I'm really curious, wherever I'm living, curious about what's going on there, and interested in the historical memory movement that was going on in Spain. And, for sure I had like a moment of doubt, like, I'm an American coming here making a film about Spain. Shouldn't there be a Spanish filmmaker making a film about Spain? But what I found was that no Spanish filmmakers were making a film on this subject. And I thought, well, why not? I see it, maybe differently than a Spanish person would see it. And a Spanish person can make his or her own film. But I feel a strong affinity with Spain. We've spent a lot of time there, living there and traveling around Spain and working there. And I have a great love for the poet Federica Garcie Lorce, who's featured in my film. I have a long, long history of making films about chapters in LGBT history that have never been uncovered before. And I've made films in many different countries, so it felt right that this was my next project. And what can I say?
I think I heard you say in one of those interviews that it was the topic that found you while you were walking around Barcelona. You saw some photos or something like that?
Yeah, it's often that way with films. If you're a documentary filmmaker, people are always trying to tell you their greatest idea that they want you to make a film about. And almost never, you're like, oh, that's a great idea, but no, you find stories, or they find you in very mysterious ways. It's never like that kind of direct route. And for me, this happened when we were living in Barcelona, and I was wandering around the city, and I stumbled upon a demonstration for historical memory in the old city of Barcelona. And that was the first kind of trigger for me. I mean, it wasn't immediate that I wanted, I have to make a documentary. It was more like I became curious. Why, in a time, this was in 2011 or maybe 2012, we were living there, why a historical memory was a reason to have a demonstration in Barcelona when it was a really difficult moment in Spain in terms of the banks and the financial crisis and the unemployment. There were general strikes where everything shut down, for days at a time. And there were a lot of really urgent contemporary issues going on that people were demonstrating about. So the fact that this group of people were demonstrating for something called historical memory really spoke to me, and I was really drawn to it. I was curious about why this was so urgent today when Franco was so many years ago. And the more I learned about it, the more I understood.
We tried to get some financial support from several Spanish officials, right? And of course, we had to explain what the film was about. And they were not amused. No, not at all. I guess you touched a subject which people often like to call a sensitive subject, and actually, as we will learn in the film, you show this specific, actually very intense culture of silence in Spain. So what was your experience when you started doing the research?
Well, Spain doesn't want to look at this subject at all. I never tried to get any funding in Spain, except for one meeting with Spanish television, and they said, oh, forget it, absolutely forget it, because the Spanish channel, which is the main channel, is the head of it is appointed by the government. So it's not going to happen. Even though there's some very open-minded and progressive people who work there, their boss is appointed by the government. And Spain is in flagrant violation of the United Nations mandates. You have to understand that even the UN, which is not the most progressive body on the planet, has said Spain has got to look at this question and try and find some way to provide some kind of justice to the victims of frankismo. And Spain has just looked the other way. So, it's not like they don't realize this is a problem. They are deliberately avoiding this problem. And even some progressive people I've met during the research, people I've spoken to. I traveled all over Spain. I lived in Malaga for a short while. I traveled to Madrid several times, Granada. I encountered many people that I would say were, on the left or liberal left, who really thought we shouldn't touch this subject. It's enough already. There's been enough said about this, which in fact is almost nothing has been said about it. So the fact that there's been enough is kind of crazy. But they just didn't understand why there was a need to look under the rug. And I think, it's not so much that there's no way to provide justice to the victims of Franco. It's too late for that. There's no way. Most of them are dead or they're very old. I think it's not so much, the historical memory movement wants justice, but I want people to acknowledge what happened, because I think it's really dangerous in history if you don't acknowledge what happened and let people get off scot-free. It's very easy for things to get even worse. My country's never looked at our role in Vietnam, for example. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to talk about it. It's a terrible history that my country has and doesn't want to look at it. So I think it's really important that we look at these painful things, even though they are painful, because there's no way to heal from them unless we look at them first.
In the film, we can see gay men, transsexuals, lesbians. We can even hear a voice of a lesbian, but we never see really her face. So in this culture of silence and some historical amnesia, what strategies did you use to actually find the people that were willing to talk about it?
Well, It was very hard to find, especially women, who would talk, because women have just, in the history, and not just in Spain, in like most Western countries, if you look at the history of lesbianism, I mean, if you go back to the first film Greta and I made together before Stonewall, we made it in the early 1980s, we had trouble finding women who would talk on camera. They would talk privately, but they didn't want to talk on camera. Many, many more men would come forward. And I found the same thing in Spain recently when I made Bones of Contention. Many more men were willing to talk than women. So the women that I found who speak about it they don't speak that much about their own personal stories. They talk about lesbians in general because they feel they need to speak for all these women who won't come forward. So, the woman who you're referring to, who tells a story on her voices in the film, but she absolutely would not agree to appear on camera. She's someone who had lived a hidden life under Franco for so many years that it wasn't comfortable for her to suddenly not be hidden. So, I mean, I have to respect that, and I have to, I can't impose my own sensibility as like openly lesbian person, a contemporary, with a contemporary sensibility on someone who's never lived like that. I'm grateful for all the people in my film who agreed to tell stories and appear in the film, or at least have their voice in the film. And, I had to work with what they were willing to do.
But do you think that if you say that lesbians are, at least in Spain, that they were less willing to talk about it than gay men, do you think it has something to do with the fact that they were not even acknowledged, they were completely invisible while men were imprisoned and tortured? So I don't know which torture, not very interesting.
Well, I think there were lesbians who, just, like I knew of lesbians. Like there was one woman, I really spent a lot of time trying to track her down and convince her to be in the film. And she had actually been imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital during the Franco years. And she had a really terrible story. And she knew one of the people in my film, Andree Weiss. So I had a lead, I had her phone number from him. And so I actually felt like maybe she would agree to be in the film because she trusted Andree Weiss, and he was in the film, and he gave me her phone number. It was a dead end. I mean, she just absolutely refused to talk about what happened to her. And so I have some people talk in general terms, but I couldn't. I think, I don't know. I mean, those experiences are painful, and some people just can never, and also maybe not everybody I wanted to interview understood that their personal story was part of a bigger picture of history. They thought of it as their own personal tragedy, and they didn't necessarily see it as an important piece of history that we can't lose. We need to know. So I think that some of the men that I don't interview that many people in the film altogether, but but I feel like in general, men were more willing to be in the film.
Well, your film, in a way, ends this era of silence, right? So now that the film is out, did you get any responses from the Spanish people about it, since you went into their history?
Well, the film hasn't opened in Spain yet. It's going to run in cinemas in September. It's going to open in, not in big cinema plexes, but in the art house cinemas. It's going to run in the major cities in September. I had all of the people who are in the film came to the premiere in the Berlin Film Festival and saw the film, and I had really positive response from them. And, we'll see what happens. I hope that it opens up a conversation. I really hope that it brings, that it starts people talking about what happened in Spain. But, it's yet to be seen what it can really achieve.
In the film, we learned that many homosexuals were imprisoned even after Franco died, right? And if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't until 2001 that some of their criminal records were deleted. I'm not sure, but I read that in some newspapers. So if we really perceive Spain as this very progressive, open-minded country where homosexual men and lesbians, etc., don't really have that many issues, knowing that this recent history was the way it was, can we really talk about the country as progressive one?
Well, you know, it's hard to talk about Spain as a unified country because they're very different mentalities. You know, for example, in Catalonia or Basque country, I mean, depending on where you go, it's really different. But I would say in the major cities, it's a very progressive climate. It's probably one of the most progressive countries in Europe. In small towns and in more conservative areas, much less open. And also it's like many other countries, it's a predominantly Catholic country. But I think what happened in Spain is that after the Franco era ended when Franco died in 1975, they had a transition to a democracy that was not really a transition. I mean, it was a negotiated settlement. You know, the king was appointed by Franco. All the high officials had been in power under Franco. There was a collusion to not talk. There was literally something they called the Pacto del Olvido, an agreement to forget the past. Literally, like, I mean, it wasn't a law, but it was a consensus. We're gonna forget about what happened. All the crimes of the Franco regime, we're gonna forget about them. So it really took until about 2000. It really took until the next generation after the generation after my generation, to break that silence, to break through. And I feel like in Spain today, there's such a kind of backlash against all those values. There's a kind of feeling like we are going to reject everything that our parents' generation agreed to. And I think there's something very progressive and almost anarchistic in it about Spain that I like a lot and I respect a lot. And I think that this whole acceptance of LGBT rights is part of that backlash against Franco. So it's kind of like if you look at the 1960s in the United States, you have the backlash against the very conservative era of the 1950s. And you see that often. You saw it in Berlin in the 1970s. Those kids of the 1970s in Germany rejected a lot of the values of their Nazi parents. And I think you have something similar in Spain. Obviously, it's different in each country, but in general, there's a very strong backlash against the values of the Franco regime that kept going after Franco died. And I do think that's truly progressive. How widespread it is, I don't know, because Spain is a fairly large country, and I've mostly spent time in the more progressive pockets of it.
Just to close up, Bones of Contention does, in a way, portray homosexual people's lives in the past. But in terms of the current turmoils around the world, it does somehow seem to blur this division or difference between past and present. So my last question would be, how do you see the present times for homosexuals and, more importantly, the future?
You know, it's funny because when I was making the film, I was thinking of this as like an important chapter in the past that people need to know about. Things happen so quickly. You know, you had Brexit, you had the United States and election resulting in Donald Trump. You had a lot of, it looked like Le Pen was doing very strongly in France. You saw this sweep of right-wing movements gaining momentum. And I suddenly started looking at my film differently. The film was finished in the end of last year, or beginning of this year. And I suddenly started thinking, it's not just about this little piece of history. It's actually I think it could contribute, I hope it will contribute to being a kind of little piece of resistance against, for the future, for people to learn from and carry with them into the future, because the past, we have an author, William Faulkner, who's quite famous in the United States for having said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And I think that's, and I would agree with him, though I don't agree with him on probably anything else. I would agree with him because we are, we carry our past around in us. We are made up of the past, and I think we need to understand, especially young people who come into the world and see that there's LGBT rights, there's certain rights, and I mean, maybe not enough, but there are definitely certain rights that we didn't have a quarter century ago or half century ago. And I think people need to understand that that's not something you could take for granted. That it's not like those were the bad old days and these are the good progressive days and they're going to get even better, because history doesn't move like that at all, and things often get much worse before they get better. Sometimes they never get better. So, I mean, I think we need to learn from history and learn to be vigilant about what we do have, and we need to resist any encroachment on that, and we need to be prepared for for dark times, because they can come very quickly.
Andrea, thank you very much. We'll see you next week as well when we will watch Greta Schiller's film. And now, well, I almost said enjoy the film, but with the topic, please, let's see the film. Thank you.
Voila.